Commissioner Callison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Callison number 1 actually asks the board to engage in a conversation. And the conversation is around the use of the Sales and Use Transportation Tax Implementation Plan that we created a couple of years ago. This is authorized by state statute. Contrary to maybe the impression that was left this morning, it is not money that can only be used for transit. When the state authorized us to take this action, it acknowledged that there might be 4 different categories of expenditure. Certainly transit is a major one, and in Hennepin County we have stepped up to the need to support a multimodal transit system, and I think we've done so more than any other county in the state. But this also gives us the ability to look at some other needs, and we have heard from staff that our infrastructure is challenged. We don't have the resources for it, and that infrastructure, roads and bridges, existing roads and bridges, means that people arrive safely at their destinations, whether they're driving or walking or taking a bike, that cars are not idling at intersections because they can move efficiently through the intersections, so there's also an impact to the environment. And it's important as part of our obligation that we make sure that we have an infrastructure that meets the needs of the county. So what this would do is authorize county staff to think through if there are unprogrammed dollars that we're collecting through the sales tax, whether or not there's a way to use those monies to support our infrastructure so that we also have a transportation system that is safe and efficient and reliable. And that's true whether we have transit or roads and bridges, and I think it's simply part of the obligation that we have as a county to fulfill. So this would simply ask the county staff to bring back a proposal that we could consider in the first quarter of 2020 about whether or not we want to think more broadly about the use of these monies.
Did you move it?
I will move it, Madam Chair.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Commissioner Opat, did you want to speak?
Sure. I'm seconded this. I support it. I think in an ideal world we wouldn't have to have this conversation because we would have Southwest underway. We would have Botno on beginning construction now. All this money would be, the sales tax money would be dedicated to those 2 lines, and then the operating deficits that follow. But we have a different reality. We don't have, we're collecting the money, we're spending it in one part of the geography of the county, and meanwhile it's in an indefinite length of time that we're going to be before we can get light rail throughout our county, and that's really where we have chosen to spend this. I think despite the best efforts of the county to budget for this, to manage CTIB when it existed, to plan for spending debt versus cash, we still face the issue where we're collecting a lot of cash and we don't have a lot of places for it to go that are appropriate in transit. We have light rail as our niche. That's what we should be doing. In the meantime, we do have great need for road projects, and we're spending it from the county's point of view. We're spending it on the property tax, and there's just a better way to do that. So I do support this, and I would just point out that we're not committing to spending it on particular projects. We're going to have the conversation. I think there's a lot of things that could fall from that. There are different projects that are of significant magnitude that are not in our CIP yet that we all might think are overdue. I can think of one. It's actually not on the fringe of my district that we are a major participant by virtue of the transfer station in eroding that freeway interchange, but there's no plan for that one in anybody's plan, and so there it sits year after year. So that might be something we would choose to fund. It might not be, but I think it's time to look at it. I wish I didn't have to say that because I wish we were on our way to the 4th light rail line, but we're not, and I think in order to spread that money around a little bit better, we should at least develop a plan.
Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a lot to say about this amendment, but let me just open up by saying how I do appreciate how measured it is. Like, as you said, Commissioner Callison, you are inviting us to have a conversation. So I really appreciate that. I also feel like that masks a little bit why this is a little alarming to me. And I guess I think of it this way. I think of transit as the skinny kid on the playground. And transit is like constantly getting beaten up and having its lunch money stolen. this is not beating up transit. This is saying like, hey, let's talk to transit. But it's leaning in with an arm on the wall behind and definitely threatening. This money, there's plenty of process around how this money should be looked at. It's in that original document. I think if we want to go this route, I don't think this is the time. Specifically, I would highlight that we anticipate that D-Line might get bonding money at the next legislative session, so let's have the conversation about this after that. I would also honestly like to have this conversation after we take control of the Senate and possibly pass a gas tax. If we're going to have this conversation, I definitely want there to be an analysis of where who has what dedicated funding, specifically contrasting roads and bridges with transit. And then backing up to my more general comments, we talked, I think, 2 weeks ago about climate change and what Hennepin County's response to climate change is going to be. I think if we chip away at this money and not use it for roads and bridges and not on transit, we're chipping away at the future that we want to build. Roads and bridges would be looking backwards. I think there are also some big unknowns in the money, in the allocations that are existing in the current document. So Botno, it's a big question mark, and I certainly want to get Botno going. So what about that? There are other unknowns ahead of us that are already committed to. I also want to highlight that we did just raise the wheelage tax, another dedicated roads and bridges source of funding. And yet it's somewhat ironic that this is being brought forward by folks who voted against that. So I'm just a little mystified about that. I mentioned the gas tax. We've talked about the timing. I guess the last thing that I really, have to say most emphatically, the conversation about transit funding, and I don't mean to imply that this is dedicated transit money and should be solely preserved for transit, but right now it is the only money that exists that has transit's name attached to it whatsoever. I know the documentation acknowledges transportation and transit, but right now this is it for transit. And the conversation that led to this pot of money has been decades in the making. And here we are talking about opening that up. And it just strikes me as a dangerous path to go down.
Madam Chair, you guys respond to so I would just say two things. One is, I am not giving up on Botno by any stretch of the imagination. I just think that this, whatever expenditures we would make from this, why I'm supporting it would be on a project by project basis, or however the rationale would come back. But it would certainly, the priority would go to the light rail lines are always going to be first for this money. And if there's anything left over, then we could look to expand the definition. The problem right now is there's a lot left over. And meanwhile, we have needs in other parts of the county. In terms of mystical, it's not too mystical about I voted against the tax because we have plenty of money. It's called this money to do what we want, or we have property tax rather than doubling up on the wheelage tax. So I'm not, there's nothing, let me clear up any mystery on that one. That's not mysterious to me or inconsistent.
Commissioner Fernando.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I also have several remarks. I first would like to clarify from staff, when you read this policy, or excuse me, this what Commissioner Callison put forward, it references unprogrammed dollars at a certain amount, $98 million at the end of 2020. I think that there is a much smaller number that is actually being that would actually be kind of within what the actions that Commissioner Callison is encouraging here. Can I hear from staff or you, Commissioner Callison, what the actual amount of dollars we're talking about here is?
Madam Chair, Commissioners, we collect approximately $135 million in this sales tax every year. Our first use of that tax is to pay for the operating subsidies of the Blue Line, the Green Line, and the North Star. That costs us something in the range of about $28 million a year. After that, then we will be putting this money into the various projects we have related at this point, basically Southwest, with a little bit of activity related to Botno. I think what this is asking us to do is come back with a plan to spend some of the marginal money. I would see this, us coming back with some sort of proposal that's in the $10 to $25 million a year but that would also be conditioned on us not having a need to do this. I think we would be, as staff, asking you if you proceeded down this path, coming back to you and saying, we would suggest you make these following plans to the transportation plan that's required by the Department of Revenue for this revenue source, and that it would be an annual discussion with you about how much of the sales tax truly was available for roads and bridges. I think you as the board ultimately have the right and responsibility to set the priorities for where this money goes. And so we would kind of see that as an ongoing thing as your response, as circumstances changes. Certainly in my mind, if Botnos starts to proceed very quickly, we'd probably have some need to pull back on any road or bridge money. But I don't anticipate that anything the board passes next spring, assuming this moves forward and you do approve something, that we're tying ourselves to any specific dollar amount in some form or fashion.
Okay.
But it would be part of the budget process every year.
Thank you. And so if I may, Madam Chair, I appreciate that clarification. Yesterday morning, I published what my plan to vote, and so I welcomed feedback from constituents. This was the item that received the most feedback, and so I want to share a few words to ensure that I'm communicating myself clearly. And definitely thank you to the hundreds of interactions that my office received based off of this. Through many of the conversations, the overall concern seemed to be that this amendment would create a permanent funding stream for roads and bridges from the transportation sales and use tax, a tax that in the last couple of years has been identified, used, and prioritized for transit projects. The short history, as referenced a bit, is a couple of years ago with the dissolution of CTIB. This tax was enacted alongside a board-approved sales and use transportation tax implementation plan, as Mr. Lawless noted. So there's the tax, which is the authority from the state, and then there's the plan that the board approved that says these are what you can use it for. And the first two uses are essentially light rail and highway BRT. The third use, and my reading of Commissioner Callison's amendment, is really authorizing staff to talk about the third use since we're in this conversation. And so personally, I read Commissioner Callison's amendment as within the policy. And so I'm happy to receive clarification from the full board if that's the case. But that's how I was reading it. And I'll quote the actual plan itself just so people can hear the third use. Capital costs associated with other transportation or transit projects or improvements as identified in Hennepin County's Capital Improvement Plan, CIP, and operating costs to the extent designated in the future by the county board after a public hearing. So the action before us, in my view, is the county's ability to access the unprogrammed dollars, what's projected to be at $98 million at the end of 2020. And as Mr. Lawless noted, staff coming back with a proposal for a conversation in the 10 to 25 million range. I want to be clear that I was initially disheartened, as Commissioner Opat noted, that we would be in a place to have this conversation. For me, it means that Hennepin does not have enough transit-eligible projects queued up in order to use these funds. And so I'm excited to work alongside staff and to continue listening to community members to ensure that we develop a more extensive transit plan where these uses might be available. But until that time, there are unprogrammed dollars, and the action before us today directs staff within the authorities of this policy is not a decision point, nor is a blanket approval. And so I'm in favor of this, first because it creates a more transparent process for these dollars. Since a public hearing is required for any project to move forward, the approval would take place over several weeks or more, and through this, I see benefits for everybody. Staff expertise is utilized for the project recommendations. Community members can voice more explicitly their opinions through public hearing processes, and the county board is able to consider decisions over time and with data in front of us. Second, I'm in favor of this amendment because it allows for an opportunity to consider how we might be imaginative considering the current policy implementation. I'm grateful that we've prioritized this in the last couple of years towards transit, and I expect staff to maintain this intention as you consider projects moving forward. Specifically, I'm interested in this because of climate change, because of population growth, because of density, and our infrastructural needs are truly becoming more and more complex. So specifically, I'm again, in favor of how we might use this policy in a way that advances the sentiment of transit, specifically recommending for staff to prioritize projects that, one, advance our regional transit commitment, such as designing roads to be more transit ready. Think of Lindale, including specific transit projects. So in the language, it includes transit projects. I'm not sure what that assessment might look like. D-line has already been referenced. Perhaps there's others. Or selecting projects that might increase local economic development. Think of Lowry. The second encouragement I have that I believe is within Commissioner Callson's amendment and within the existing policy is to do all of this in alignment with Hennepin's existing policy, specifically Complete Streets. This should allow us to be responsive to recent events by investing in the safety of pedestrians and cyclists. And then three, for staff to consider what projects might have been delayed or what projects might present unique funding challenges. For example, the county board received a presentation on dozens of bridges that no matter what mode you are engaging in, we require bridges to cross into other geographies, to literally cross the river and get where we need to go. So that third item being, are there projects that have been delayed or present unique funding challenges? So again, I believe my comments are within Commissioner Callson's amendment, which is why I'm supporting it. And I believe Commissioner Callson's amendment is also within the existing policy. And I am too very, very hopeful to advance our regional transit commitment, which is said over and over again in this existing policy, and welcome continued conversation over the months to do so.
Okay, it's
Thank
going
you,
to go.
Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Johnson, Callison, and then Conley. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I do support this, and I recall the debate 2, 3, 4 years ago, however long it was that we passed this, and we talked about how the third priority would encompass roads if something came up, or if we felt like that need became greater than the transit needs, or maybe that there was some extra money in the fund. And I remember people saying, that day will come, but that's not where we are right now. Well, it does appear that that day has come. And since that meeting, we have had many meetings where we have all 7 of us have talked about how underfunded roads are in this town, or at least most of us have, and how we need a new source of funding and we need to raise taxes because our roads aren't good enough. I would agree with that, by the way, that our roads aren't good enough and that we have a lot that are in poor shape. And, apparently some people believe that crumbling roads are fine because roads are evil. But they're not. Everyone in this county relies upon our roads, even if they don't drive a car. If they ride a bus, they need a road. If they want groceries at their grocery store, somebody needs to bring it to their grocery store. If they want an ambulance to come to their house, they need a road. So we all rely upon them heavily, and this is just an opportunity to get a proposal to use a relatively small percentage of this money that's not being used for anything else to actually help fund what is a great need in the county right now. So I welcome this, and we'll support it.
Commissioner Callison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just have to comment, I think it's so unfortunate that the lack of funding for transportation in this state has left us in this conversation. Yeah. So left us first with the advocacy groups that think roads are evil, comparisons of people who support roads to bullies in the playground. I mean, if you want the road to be better, that's the image that you get. We all have needs, and we have a system that has to serve everybody, and we have goals that we are trying to advance, and certainly climate change is one of those things that we're concerned about, certainly access. All we're doing is having a broader conversation about whether or not there is some small amount of this fund that can be used to meet a few pressing needs that will help ensure that people safely get to where they are going, and it will happen in an efficient, reliable way. And we're clearly going to have a more lengthy conversation and a challenging conversation around this. That's why we exist as a policy board. But I think it's appropriate to take the first step, and that's to have staff bring this idea back to us and have a full and exhaustive conversation in the first quarter of next year.
Commissioner Conley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the D-line was mentioned twice, and I remember we initially had the conversation about this tax when we were talking about the wheelage tax. I am a very strong advocate for arterial bus rapid transit. We have said over and over again, the Met Council has said, transit advocates have said that the D-line, which would replace the number 5, is the top needed priority right now. We didn't get it in session. We've got the largest ridership route in the state that touches 4 commissioner districts. The second highest ridership route is the Lake Street bus, number 21, sorry. That's the B as in boy line. That's the second highest priority for bus rapid transit. Yet every time I went to testify at the Capitol last year, we didn't get any of it. So I'm looking forward to bonding, because if we're going to talk about transit and usage of this tax, I want to talk about the D and the B line. So I'd even be interested in the second resolving clause where it's not first quarter 2020, maybe it's second quarter 2020. Let's get through bonding. Let's get through some of the priorities that we have about bus rapid transit. I've heard that, my district is saturated with bus rapid transit, yet I've got people in a very poor community around Phillips that have to take 2 to 3 buses that are slow, that never come on time, just to get to the light rail. So prioritizing things like that. We talk about climate change. We want, we've got the Met Council working to make sure these buses are green, to make sure these fleets are green, that they're electric, so that poorer neighborhoods along these lines can breathe clean air. So for me, this is about transit priorities and transit practices. I hear and I understand what my colleagues are talking about in terms of other uses and opening up a conversation. But for me, that conversation begins with closing gaps on much needed lines within our areas. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple comments and then kind of 2 maybe closing points. One is, I want to address the notion that these are currently unprogrammed dollars. We have big expenses. I think our transit investments, Southwest Light Rail, we're 50% of the we're 50% of the whole project, so that is a massive expense ahead of us. We don't collect that $1 billion in 1 year. We have to put the money away for that time. So the notion that these are unprogrammed dollars, I find a bit specious. The second thing is the notion that we are adding a public hearing, so we're actually going to have more transparency. No, the public hearing is already in the guiding documents that we passed 2 years ago. That's spelled out here in black and white. So we're not adding a public hearing. What we're saying is we're open to conversation about how we spend this money, and we'll have the public hearing that's required. I also want to mention that I'm excited about the ideas like having a transit-friendly Lindale, et cetera, but we don't specify projects. If we do decide to peel away some of this money next year after appropriate process and so on, we don't specify the projects. The projects are specified in the CIP, our capital improvement plan. And so that's where we need to get, building green roads, et cetera, in. It's not, it won't be specified as we decide to spend this money. So the notion that, we can free it up to spend it on green technology, green roads, green bridges. No, let's look to our CIP and see how green that document is, and then let's talk. I also want to add a layer of history, an additional layer of history. So we talked about the creation of we went back to the dissolution of CTIB, but let me take us back to the creation of CTIB. At the legislature, essentially no roads and bridges money passes without allocated transit money, and that's because that's how the coalition is built. CTIB was created to be the venue where that conversation would happen, the County Transit Improvement Board. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately for some, CTIB dissolved, that kind of regional coalition fell apart, and we essentially took on the taxing authority that we were authorized through the creation of CTIB and started collecting these dollars. But again, I want to just ground us in this history that this was conceived as the transit dollars. So just that. And then the last thing I want to close on is precedent. If we start to spend money, or if we spend an iota of money this early on of this bank account on roads and bridges, it just always creates that moment that can be looked back to in the future as like, oh, but we've already spent some of this money on roads and bridges. And I think that's equally as dangerous.
Thank you. I want to add some comments as well, because I have concerns too, because we haven't passed a gas tax and the state has not come up to the table for its part of the transit, and we have picked that up. And while I like conversation and I think it brings out a lot of great ideas, I am concerned about doing this right at this time. When I looked at the data on climate analysis and what's happening and how much more rapidly we're changing the climate than we even thought we did, they say we need to double down on transit. And if we don't get dollars through the state, we will be left with having to do it if we decide to do that. And that's the way forward if we're addressing climate change. It will be still on us. I'm also concerned with unknown operation costs that could happen. There could be things that break down and everything. Anything that happens on any of these rails that we have operation obligations to can be very costly. We don't know about that. And I'm concerned too about the botno and the fact of looking where that might go in the future. And I think as long as we wait, it only grows in the amount of dollars that we need. And finally, I'm always concerned when we're going to do something like this, when the state looks at these dollars and we decide to cordon off some of the dollars for this, that they will have expectations that we won't get dollars for some of this because, well, you have that pot of money, Hennepin County, we'll expect you to tap into those dollars. And so that is a real concern of mine as well. Other comments or thoughts? I'm going to call the question then. All those in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Irene?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. It passed.